Hello everyone, I'm James Milan with Arlington Public News. For those of you who have been watching Arlington Public News newscasts for a while, and we know you're out there, you may be familiar with the name of my guest today, Aaron Walck. Aaron was one of our prize interns up till he left us in May of 2014. He spent most of his last months while a student at Tufts interning here at Arlington Public News, and then he went off on an adventure, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So Aaron, thanks so much for coming on in.
Thanks for having me, James.
It's a real pleasure to see you again.
It's all mine.
So for most people, whether they're 22 or 42 or 62, the idea of doing what you have just come back from doing is unusual, exotic. So just explain to our audience, where have you been for the last number of months and what have you been up to?
Well, thank you, James. For 6 months from June of 2014 to December of 2014, I was backpacking solo through South America from Uruguay on the Atlantic coast towards the south to Ecuador on the Pacific coast up in the northern corner.
Yeah, so there's a lot there,
Yeah.
I have to say, between those lines. You make it sound simple, but for one thing, you chose to do this solo. And in South America, I assume then that your Spanish was decent to proficient before you began?
I would hope so. I've been studying Spanish for about 8 years in total now, from high school to majoring in college at Tufts University. Granted, it doesn't mean I'm fluent in every situation. You're always going to find a new word or something you don't recognize or a new accent, but I like to think I'm at least well-versed.
I'm sure you are by now,
yeah.
So what brought about, though, the idea? Had it been long in gestation for you, this idea of heading off on a solo adventure of this sort, or?
Not exactly when it ended up happening, but for a couple of years beforehand, I had the idea of, when I'm done with college, I'm not going to be completely ready to enter the job force, and that's a special time right afterwards where people my age who have the opportunity to take some time for themselves can go do something like what I did and not harm themselves too much in the job market or not come back too late. So I figured, why not? It's one of those things that I didn't know exactly why I was doing it and when I was doing it, but it just felt right. And looking back, I don't regret a thing.
I'm sure, and we will delve a little bit more into what you experienced, what you got out of it, what you feel about it, looking back on it now, etc. But I'm wondering, just for those who, for whom this might sound tantalizing in a sense, how much preparation do you do beforehand?
To be honest, I planned on doing a lot more preparation than I actually did. I got a map of the continent. I looked at it for a while just to get a general idea of, what directions I could go and when, what's actually feasible distance-wise. I originally wanted to go to see the World Cup in Brazil, but that would have been very difficult language-wise as they speak Portuguese there. And just getting around a country that I'm not very familiar with. And to be honest, I ended up just getting the general idea of how much time I wanted to spend. I bought a one-way ticket and just went, packed up my bags and left.
And would you recommend that kind of approach to people? Or is that one of the things that you would do differently, or?
To be honest, I'm still not sure. For certain people, yeah. If you're willing to just take it as the adventure comes, why not just get a one-way ticket and go? But it's probably a lot more beneficial if you know something about where you're going, such as the language or a bit of the history or the culture. Without that, I'd recommend at least a little bit of preparation, but otherwise just do it.
Had you visited Latin America before that?
That's a great question. Actually, the first time I visited was to Ecuador when I was 16 for a 3-week language immersion summer course. And then I studied abroad in Chile during the fall semester of 2012 at Tufts University. And that's really where, to reference an earlier question, you asked how long I've been thinking about this, pretty much since 2012. And I just wanted to see a lot more of certain countries that I'd already visited, but not too extensively. And I also wanted to see a few new countries, a few new places.
Right. So yeah, talking about the trip itself,
Yeah.
then. Again, I'm fascinated by the fact that you did most or perhaps all of this solo. I imagine that as you're traveling around, you'd have contact with other travelers on occasion, and obviously with natives of whichever country you're in.
Right.
Were you in daily contact with other people, or were you spending certain long amounts of time really on your own?
That's a great question. It was a weird mix of course, daily contact with mostly locals. I stayed in hostels most of the time, so there would be a lot of travelers from all over the world there, from Europe, the US, other places in South America. So I got to have daily contact either with the people lodging in those hostels, or the people running them, or people I meet just exploring whichever city I'm in on a given day. But with the pace of my trip, I didn't spend very much time in each location. So I didn't really get to meet a whole lot of people for an extended period of time. It was more a couple of days, and then you're moving on.
And how do you feel about that part of the trip? The fact that you covered a lot of ground, but never really dug down
Right.
temporary routes, at least,
Right.
for any length of time.
That's something I would have liked to have done in hindsight. I mean, hindsight's 2020, so what are you gonna do? But I think it would be nice to someday go back and try and sow my roots a little more. But at the same time, I would have never been able to see 6 different countries in that period of time had I stayed in one for an extended couple of weeks. So looking back, I think I made the right decision, although it's a little difficult sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
So now I'd just like to ask you, just in a general sense, what are some of the notable things that either happened to you or that you took part in, impressions that you came away with about different countries, perhaps, that you didn't know about before? That kind of aspect of the trip.
Well, I got lucky actually, because although I didn't get to go to Brazil for the World Cup, I was in Argentina when they played in the finals, and needless to say, that was a bit of a riot in multiple senses of the word. So that was something that I'm probably never going to be able to see again. That was really cool. Even though they lost, they went crazy.
Yeah. Singular event for sure.
You bet. And better to be there than in Brazil during this World Cup. And there were a few just sites naturally that were phenomenal. And some of them are world famous, like the salt flats in Bolivia, where you can see essentially for miles around of just plain salt surface. That's incredible.
Seeming to go on forever, I assume.
Right, pretty much. And I'd say the highlight of the trip in total would have been going to the Amazon. As limited as my few days actually on the river were, it's something I think everyone needs to see. It's something that you will never see if you just stay in the U.S. your entire life.
Well, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And why is that? What about that?
It's just so vast. The river, you can read as much as you want about it. You can see it on television, but once you're swimming in it, it looks a lot bigger than it does on a screen. Yeah.
And so you spend some time in the Amazon, obviously.
Yeah, you can't. It's not advised to go in the actual main river itself because the current will take you away.
Right, that's what
but
I
one of the
assume.
tributaries, it's actually kind of comforting. It feels good when it's really, really hot there. So.
And you were traveling, I think, in what was summertime. Is that right? I guess
By the
spring
end,
and
I was in
summertime
summer. But when you're in the jungle, it's either
always
rainy
summer.
season or sunny season. Yeah, and it's always going to be really hot. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back there while being here right now and with it being snowy all over the place.
So anything surprising on the negative side? Either things that were harder than you thought they were going to be. Some I don't know. Did anything scary happen at any point?
Well, I'd say the most difficult surprise would be just that extended period of time by yourself, traveling constantly. I didn't think about it beforehand and think it would be very difficult, but after months of not necessarily having the most contact with people that you're familiar with, it gets a little difficult.
Is that about your conception of yourself, or?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I've completely flushed that through. It's a little odd being in a given place every day for what, 6 months, where you know you're at a bit of a fish out of water, where you are the other person, the person who doesn't necessarily belong. And that's something that I think a lot of people, especially like myself in the United States, they don't get that experience very often. And to be honest, it's difficult, but it's very humbling.
Yeah, and so now here you are,
Yeah.
back in the U.S. in
Yeah.
comfortable surroundings, familiar circumstances. What are you still carrying that you're aware of from your months down south?
Aside from the fact that I want to go back,
Do you see these familiar surroundings through different eyes at this point, or?
I see odd similarities between here and different places in South America. Just very basic things from, how highways look to traffic lights, like very mundane, everyday things where you wouldn't think, oh, this is the same in a completely different country. But at the same time, it's made me look at, especially how I live up here, how people I know, loved ones, friends live, that I know there are people that cannot live that way just by basic necessity. And I'm not going to be, calling people out on stuff every day, but it's something that I internalize and try to think about.
Great.
Yeah.
Anything else that you wanted to add about your experience that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Well, you mentioned if there was anything difficult, if I had encountered something maybe dangerous or scary. I think typically what people from this country think of Latin America would be a more dangerous atmosphere. And sure, there are places everywhere, and certainly places that I went that I wouldn't necessarily recommend people going. But I wasn't robbed once. I was never held up once. I never felt physically in danger once. So I think keeping that in perspective, there's a lot that we don't know about Latin America.
And a lot of that is in fact more comforting or more stimulating, et cetera, than we might assume.
Yep.
Well, that's great. I know you're now back here as a recent college graduate, embarking on the job search, et cetera.
You bet.
And I imagine that this will be a good story for you to tell prospective employers and family members and other people you meet.
I hope so.
But clearly of much greater value than that to you in the living of it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, James.
So we're really glad to have you back.
Thanks.
And Aaron truly was helped set the bar in the first class of interns here at APN that subsequent interns have been living up to for a long time. So we appreciate very much the work that he did here. Delighted to hear about his adventures in Latin America, and hope to check in with Aaron more in the future as further adventures await him. Thank you so much for joining us here today. For Arlington Public News, I'm James Millan.